The roof over the east bedroom had been leaking since August, and Thomas Hargrove had gotten so used to the sound of water dripping into the metal pot on the floor that he no longer heard it as a problem. He heard it as a clock. A slow, patient countdown to the moment when this house would finally give up what it had been threatening to give up for 2 years. And on the morning his son was born, 3 weeks early in the back bedroom because the roads were iced over and the ambulance was 40 minutes away, Thomas had stood in that same room with one arm and a prayer and delivered James Walter Hargrove into the world himself. And when the baby cried for the first time, Thomas had pressed his forehead against Caroline's and wept in a way he had not wept since the field hospital in Kandahar, when a surgeon told him the arm was gone and the rest of him was going to have to be enough. He was 34 years old. He had served 2 tours with the 82nd Airborne. He had come home with a Purple Heart, a medical discharge, and a wound that started below his left elbow and went all the way down into the part of him that still, on certain mornings, reached for things that were no longer there. The phantom pain was manageable now. The phantom life was harder. The version of himself he had imagined coming home to, the man who would fix the porch and build the crib and carry his wife over the threshold of a life they had earned together, that man had required 2 hands, and so Thomas had quietly buried him somewhere in the long months of rehabilitation and learned to become someone new. Someone who buttoned his shirts differently and held his coffee mug differently and moved through the world with the careful, deliberate economy of a man who has stopped taking anything for granted. Caroline never once made him feel lesser. That was the thing about her that undid him completely. She was 29 and beautiful in the way that strong, quiet women are beautiful, not in spite of hardship, but because of it. Shaped by it the way good wood is shaped by pressure, until what remains is something finer than what you started with. She worked 3 mornings a week at the pharmacy downtown and spent the rest of her time caring for James and keeping the house together with a tenacity that Thomas watched every day with a mixture of gratitude and grief. Gratitude because she was still there, still his, still certain in her love in a way that asked nothing in return. Grief because he knew what she was holding back. He could see it in the evenings when he thought he wasn't watching, when she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard with an expression that was not quite sadness and not quite fear, but something that lived in the country between the two. One evening in October, she did not know he was behind her, and he heard her say, very softly, to no one, to the window, to the dark Kansas sky out it, "I don't know how, Lord. I just don't know how." He did not go to her. He stood in the doorway with his son asleep against his chest, and he absorbed those words the way a man absorbs a wound, without flinching outwardly, with everything happening on the inside. And he made himself a promise in that moment that he would find a way. He did not know what way. He only knew he had to find it. He did not know that 63 miles away, a man named Walter Crane had already found it for him. Walter was 71 years old, a retired Army Corps of Engineers sergeant who had done 2 tours in Vietnam and spent the 30 years after that building things, homes, community centers, a school gymnasium in a town that couldn't afford a contractor, a veterans hall in Millfield that still had his handprints in the concrete of the foundation because he had mixed the first batch himself on a freezing February morning and hadn't bothered with gloves. He was a large man with a face like weathered limestone and hands that looked like they had never once in 71 years been entirely clean. And he had a way of standing very still when he was thinking that people who didn't know him sometimes mistook for stubbornness. It was not stubbornness. It was the stillness of a man who only moves when he is certain of his direction. His wife Helen had died 4 years earlier, in the spring, when the lilacs were blooming, which Walter considered either a cruelty or a grace depending on the day. He missed her in the specific way that a man misses the person who made him legible to himself, who translated his silences and honored his habits and never once asked him to be more talkative than he was capable of being. He had her photograph on the kitchen table, and every morning he drank his coffee across from it and told her the one true thing he was thinking. And most mornings the one true thing was that he didn't quite know what to do with himself now that she was gone. He had read about Thomas in the Cedar Falls Courier on a Thursday morning in early October, a small article, 4 inches of column space, a photograph of a young veteran standing in his yard with one arm and a steady, undefeated gaze, a house deteriorating behind him that he was clearly too proud to describe as what it was. Walter had read the article twice. He had looked at the photograph for a long time. He had looked across the table at Helen's photograph, and he had said, out loud, the one true thing he was thinking. That boy needs a house, Helen. He made the first call that afternoon. Within 48 hours, he had commitments from 9 men. A master electrician named Raymond Good, who served in the Gulf and never once charged a veteran for labor. A Carl Bittner, who was 66 years old and had bad knees and showed up to every job site anyway, because, as he always said, knees were negotiable and character was not. A foundation crew from a construction company whose owner, a man named Paul Stearns, had a son currently deployed in Syria and who said when Walter called, "You tell me the address and I'll have a crew there by Monday." A retired farmer named Gerald Whittemore who donated the land itself, 2 acres of flat Kansas ground with good drainage and a view of the fields that went all the way to the horizon, because Gerald had buried a son named Marcus who came home from Iraq in a flag-draped box, and he had been looking for somewhere to put all that love ever since. Walter designed the house himself at his kitchen table over 3 evenings with a cup of tea and Helen's photograph and the particular focused quiet of a man doing the most important work of his life. He made the doorways wide and the countertops low on one side and the kitchen large enough for a family that intended to grow. He put a front porch on it because a house without a front porch was just a box, and Thomas Hargrove had not given his arm so his family could live in a box. He put a window in the nursery that faced east so that James Walter Hargrove would wake up every morning of his childhood with the sun coming in first thing, the way children ought to. He called Thomas on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after he had broken ground, because Walter Crane did not make promises on foundations that hadn't been poured yet. Thomas was feeding James when the phone rang. He answered it with the practiced sideways tilt of a man who has learned to hold a phone without a second hand, and he heard a voice that was deep and unhurried and carried in it the particular weight of someone who has nothing to prove and nowhere he needs to be except exactly here. "Mr. Hargrove," the voice said, "my name is Walter Crane, and I'm a veteran, Corps of Engineers, 2 tours in Vietnam. I've been reading about your situation, and I want you to know that some of us have already started working on something for your family." Thomas said nothing. James made a small sound against his chest. "We're building you a new home," Walter said. "Foundation is poured. Frame goes up Saturday." The silence that followed was the longest Thomas had experienced since the moment before the IED detonated, that half-second of absolute stillness when the world hadn't yet decided what it was going to do. He stood in his leaking kitchen with his son against his chest, and he felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in so long he'd nearly stopped believing in it. It was not relief. It was deeper than relief. It was the sensation of a man discovering that the world had not, in fact, written him off, that somewhere, without his knowledge, without his asking, people had looked at his life and decided it was worth fighting for. "Why?" Thomas said. It was the only word he had. Walter was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice was low and even, and it carried the particular authority of a truth that has been carried a long time before being spoken. "Because 40 years ago I came back from Vietnam with nothing, and a man I had never met put a roof over my head and told me I wasn't finished yet. I've been trying to pay that back ever since.
I'm just glad I finally found the right place to put it." Thomas closed his eyes. James shifted against him. Outside, the plastic sheeting over the kitchen window snapped once in the wind. "I don't know what to say to you," Thomas said. "You don't have to say anything," Walter said. "Just bring your family out Saturday morning. We'll be the ones making all the noise."
Caroline drove them out in the old pickup, with James in the car seat between them, and Thomas with his hand resting on the window glass, watching the Kansas plains open up around them, the gold of the October fields, the sky enormous and blue and indifferent to everything except its own beauty. When they turned down the dirt road to Gerald Whittemore's land, and Thomas saw the frame of the house rising against that sky, clean and straight, and already unmistakably a home, he did not speak. He put his hand over his mouth, and he did not speak. There were 14 men working. Some of them Thomas recognized as veterans by the way they moved, the economy of motion, the absence of wasted gesture, the way they worked side by side without needing to narrate what they were doing. Others were simply tradesmen, neighbors, men who had heard about a young soldier and a leaking roof and a newborn baby, and had decided, without anyone asking them twice, that they had something to give. A woman named Dorothy Shelby had set up a folding table near the tree line with coffee and sandwiches and 4 separate pies, and she pressed a cup of coffee into Caroline's free hand before Caroline had fully gotten out of the truck, and said, with the brisk tenderness of a woman who has been organizing kindness all her life, "You just watch, they know what they're doing." Walter walked over slowly, the way he did everything, and he shook Thomas's hand and held it a beat longer than a regular handshake, and then he looked at James, sleeping in the carrier against Thomas's chest, and his face did something complicated and quiet, and he said nothing at all for a moment, just nodded, the way men nod when the thing in front of them is too large to approach from the front and must be approached from the side, slowly, with respect. "He's got your eyes," Walter said finally. Thomas looked down at his son and then back up at this man he had known for 30 seconds and already trusted completely. "His middle name is Walter," Thomas said. Walter looked away toward the tree line. He was quiet for long enough that Thomas wondered if he'd said something wrong. Then Walter cleared his throat once and said, still looking at the trees, "Helen would have gotten a real kick out of that." The house took 5 weeks. It should have taken 8. But men who are building something that matters do not watch the clock the way men do when they are simply filling time. Raymond Good ran wire on 2 consecutive Saturdays without stopping for lunch. Carl Bittner wrapped his knees every morning and worked until the light was gone, and never once complained, though Thomas noticed he accepted the folding chair Dorothy offered him at the end of each day, with the deep, wordless tenderness of a woman who has been organizing kindness all her life. Paul Stearns brought a different crew member each weekend, rotating his people through so that as many of them as possible could say they had put their hands on this particular house. Gerald Whittemore came out every Sunday and did not work because his back would not allow it, but he sat in a lawn chair at the edge of the property and watched, and once Thomas came and sat beside him, and neither of them said anything for a long time. And then
Gerald said, "My boy Marcus loved this land." And Thomas said, "Then I'm glad it's under our foundation." And Gerald nodded and looked at the sky, and that was enough. On the morning they finished, the first hard frost of November had come in overnight, and the fields were white, and the air was sharp and clean, and the house stood in it like a declaration. Thomas and Caroline arrived to find all 14 men standing on the front porch they had built, wide enough for a rocking chair and a stroller side by side, and Walter was holding a single key on a plain ring, and he held it out to Thomas without ceremony, without a speech, because Walter Crane had never once in his life believed that the moment of giving required decoration. Thomas took the key. He looked at it in his palm for a long time. Caroline pressed her face into his shoulder, and her shoulder shook. James was awake and looking up at the sky with the unfocused wonder of a 3-month-old discovering that the world is enormous and full of light. "Go on," Walter said quietly. "It's yours." Thomas walked through his front door for the first time and stopped in the middle of the living room and breathed. New wood, fresh paint, warmth coming up through the floor from a heating system that worked. The east window of the nursery caught the morning light and threw it in a long gold bar across the hallway, and in that light, Thomas stood and felt the last of something leave him. The last of the shame, the last of the desperate, silent arithmetic of a man trying to calculate whether he is enough. And what replaced it was not pride exactly, and not relief exactly, but something older and quieter than either of those things. It was the feeling of a man who has been found. Caroline came and stood beside him and took his hand, and they looked at their home together, and she said softly, "Can you believe it? It's real." "It's real," Thomas said. "We're home." Outside on the porch, Walter Crane put his hands in his pockets and looked out at the frost-white fields of Kansas and felt Helen the way he sometimes did when the world got very quiet and very right. And he said to her under his breath, under the cold blue November sky, "I think we're square now." He stood there a moment longer. Then he smiled, the rare, full smile of a man who has finished what he came to do, and he walked back to his truck and drove home through the beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary world. The lesson this story carries cannot be nailed into a board or measured in square feet, but it is as real as any structure ever built. It is this: a man's worth is not in the limbs he keeps, but in the life he chooses to show up for. Dignity, once shattered, can be rebuilt, not by one set of hands, but by many, by a community that understands that the debt owed to those who sacrifice everything is not paid by a flag at a ceremony, but by showing up on a cold Saturday morning with tools and coffee and the willingness to stay until the job is done. Walter Crane did not save Thomas Hargrove. He simply refused to let him believe he was alone. And sometimes that is the whole of salvation. If this story found something in you, if it reminded you that goodness is still out here, still building, still arriving unannounced with a hammer and a plan, please take a moment right now and subscribe to the Kind Soul Stories. Every single subscriber tells us that you want more veterans, more quiet heroes, more stories of the ordinary people who hold this country together with loyalty and love and the courage to act when it would be so much easier to look away. Ring that bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. We will never stop bringing these stories to you because they are true and they matter, and so do you. This story carries genuine educational weight on several important levels. It accurately reflects the psychological reality of veteran reintegration, specifically the silent shame that many amputees and wounded veterans experience, the sense of failing one's family, and the difficulty of accepting help from others. It models the concept of intergenerational service, showing how one act of kindness given to Walter Crane decades ago creates a ripple that reaches Thomas Hargrove 40 years later and will likely reach someone else 40 years after that. It illustrates the power of community-organized direct action over institutional aid, not dismissing the VA or government support, but showing what neighbors and fellow veterans can accomplish when they choose to act personally. It also honors the quiet sacrifice of military spouses like Caroline, whose resilience is rarely celebrated but is absolutely foundational to veteran recovery. For older American viewers, this story affirms something they have always known and sometimes feared the younger generation has forgotten, that the deepest form of patriotism is not ceremonial but practical, not loud but present, not transactional but freely given.